On Christmas Eve, my husband's secretary called me. "Your husband and I have been together for 7 years. You need to know." I thanked her and smiled at my husband. Under his plate lay an envelope that I had prepared an hour before. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me when I knew. They expect me to say it was the phone call. But honestly, I think I knew long before that Christmas Eve. I just chose not to look too closely at the shape of the things standing in my own living room. My name is Claire Alderman. I was 38 years old, living in a 4-bedroom colonial in Naperville, Illinois. Married to Nathan Alderman for 11 years. We had a golden retriever named Biscuit, a vegetable garden I kept in the backyard, and a standing Friday night dinner reservation at a little Italian place on Washington Street where the owner knew our order by heart. From the outside, we looked exactly like what we were supposed to be. Nate was a senior partner at a mid-sized commercial real estate firm downtown. I worked part-time as a landscape consultant, which gave me enough flexibility to manage the house, attend his firm's client dinners, and still feel like I had something of my own. We didn't have children. That had been a conversation that came and went in our early 30s and eventually settled into a quiet, mutual acceptance neither of us ever fully unpacked. We had a life, a real one, or so I believed. The first signal came 18 months before that Christmas, though I didn't name it as such at the time. Nate started working later, not dramatically, not the sudden, obvious kind of late that makes a wife's stomach drop. Just incrementally. 7 o'clock became 7:30. 7:30 became 8. He always had a reason. A closing that ran long. A client in from Phoenix. A deposition for a lease dispute. Each explanation was plausible. Each one landed cleanly. I accepted them all. Then came the phone. He'd always been relaxed about his phone. Left it on the kitchen counter, never flinched when I walked past it. Sometime around February of that year, he started carrying it. Into the bathroom. To bed. He'd flip it face down when I sat beside him on the couch. I noticed. I told myself I was being paranoid. I actually said that to myself. "Claire, you're being paranoid," and moved on to the next thing on my mental list. There was a weekend trip to Chicago that spring. Client entertaining, he said, which wasn't unusual. He went alone, which also wasn't unusual. But when he came back Sunday evening, he smelled different. Not like another woman's perfume, nothing that cinematic. He smelled like a hotel. That specific laundered, climate-controlled, anonymous air that clings to you after 2 days in a room that isn't yours. I'd traveled enough to recognize it. I hugged him and said nothing. Dana Kowalski had been his assistant for 9 years. I'd met her at 3 or 4 firm events over the years. A compact woman with a precise blonde bob and the kind of relentless competence that makes administrative staff invisible to everyone except the person they're supporting. She was efficient, polished, and utterly forgettable to me, which, I would later understand, was exactly what she'd wanted. By autumn, I had accumulated enough small, individually dismissible details to fill a folder, if I'd been paying the right kind of attention. A receipt for a wine bar I'd never been to, found in his coat pocket when I was taking it to the dry cleaner. A hotel loyalty points notification that appeared on our shared email account for a stay in a city Nate had never mentioned visiting. A particular way he'd started laughing at his phone. Quiet, private, turned slightly away. I still did nothing. Not because I was stupid. Because I was afraid. Because dismantling the structure of your own life requires a courage that doesn't arrive on a convenient schedule. It arrived on December 24th. I had spent that day cooking. I'd made a crown roast, Nate's favorite, with rosemary potatoes and a red wine reduction. The dining room table was set with the good china, Candles lit, the tree glowing in the next room. Biscuit was asleep by the fireplace. It looked, genuinely, like the cover of a holiday magazine. Nate was washing his hands in the kitchen when my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered out of habit. "Is this Claire Alderman?" A woman's voice. Measured. Deliberate. Not nervous at all, which somehow made it worse. "Yes," I said. "My name is Dana Kowalski. I'm Nathan's assistant. I think you should know, Nate and I have been together for 7 years. A real relationship. Not just an affair. I thought you deserved to hear it from someone." Then she hung up. I stood in my kitchen doorway with the phone in my hand. From the hall, I heard the water shut off. Heard Nate's footsteps on the hardwood. He appeared in the doorway, hair slightly damp, smiling at the candles, smelling of cedar soap. "That smells incredible," he said. "I'm starving." I smiled back at him. "Sit down," I said. "Dinner's ready." What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that 1 hour before that phone call, I had already placed an envelope beneath his dinner plate. I watched him eat. That sounds strange, I know. But I sat across that candlelit table and watched my husband of 11 years cut his roast, refill his wine glass, comment on the potatoes, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage, not grief. A strange, surgical calm, as though someone had pressed a cold cloth against a fever I'd been carrying for months without knowing it. He found the envelope when he lifted his plate to pass it to me to serve him a second helping. He did that instinctively, a small domestic habit, 11 years old. His hand touched the paper, and he paused. "What's this?" "Open it," I said. He looked at me once. Something crossed his face. Not guilt, not yet. More like the face of a man who's stepped onto ice and isn't sure yet whether it will hold. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single document, a signed retainer agreement with Patricia Howe, one of the most respected family law attorneys in DuPage County. I had contacted Patricia's office 3 weeks earlier, not because I had proof, but because some part of me had understood, below the level of conscious thought, that I needed to know where the door was before I needed to run through it. The retainer was modest, enough to put her on standby, enough to make the relationship official and protected. Beneath the retainer was a handwritten note in my own handwriting. It said, "I know. I've known for a while. Now it's time to have an honest conversation." Nate set the paper down carefully, the way you set down something breakable. "Claire." "Not tonight," I said. "I'm not doing this tonight." And I meant it. I picked up my fork. I ate my dinner. I let the candles burn down. What happened in that room over the next hour, his half-formed sentences, his deflections, his eventual silence, I won't recount in detail, because that part wasn't the story. That was just the wreckage revealing itself. He slept in the guest room that night. I lay in our bed with Biscuit curled at my feet and the ceiling above me, and I did what I should have done months ago. I thought clearly. Here is what I knew. We had been married 11 years. We owned the house jointly. Purchased 8 years ago for $412,000, now worth considerably more. I had worked part-time for the duration of our marriage, scaling back my career specifically to support his. I had attended his client dinners, managed his household, organized his life. And for at least 7 of those 11 years, he had been conducting a parallel relationship with his assistant. 7 years. Dana hadn't said it to wound me, or maybe she had. But the number was what I kept returning to. 7 years meant this wasn't a moment of weakness. It wasn't a mistake he'd made and regretted. It was a choice he'd made and sustained, over and over, across holidays and anniversaries, and the ordinary Tuesday mornings when he'd kissed me goodbye on his way out the door. The fear came in around 3 in the morning. Real fear. The kind that sits on your chest. I was 38 years old. I had a part-time income, a house I couldn't afford on my own, a professional identity I'd allowed to thin out in service of someone else's ambitions. What did I have, really, that was mine? But fear, I've learned, is information, not instruction. I got up before dawn, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. I wrote down everything I had. The house value, my contributions to it, not just financial, but the years of unpaid domestic labor that Illinois courts do, in fact, recognize. The career I had demonstrably reduced, the length of the marriage, and I wrote down what I didn't yet have but needed. Documentation, bank records, credit card statements, evidence of the relationship itself, enough to establish the pattern, the duration, the deliberateness of what he'd done. Illinois is a no-fault divorce state, which meant his affair was not, strictly speaking, grounds for financial penalty. But Patricia had told me, in our initial consultation, that proof of dissipation of marital assets, money spent on an affair partner, could be brought before a judge. Hotel stays? Dinners? Gifts? Trips to Chicago? That receipt I'd found in his coat pocket. I went upstairs, quietly, and retrieved it from the small zippered pocket in my winter handbag where I'd placed it months ago, telling myself I was being paranoid. I had kept it. Somewhere in my body, without my conscious mind signing off on the decision, I had known. I sat back down at the table. I wrote a list, not of feelings, but of actions. I would need bank statements going back 3 years. I would need his credit card records, some of which I had legal access to as a joint account holder. I would need to document my own professional sacrifices with whatever records I could find. And I would need, most importantly, to move quietly. Because Nate was not a stupid man, and Dana Kowalski, I was beginning to understand, was not a careless woman. They had maintained this for 7 years. They were practiced at concealment, which meant I needed to be better. I put the legal pad away. I fed Biscuit. I watched the winter sun come up over the backyard garden, bare now, frozen under an inch of snow. Then I picked up my phone and texted Patricia Howe's office. I'm ready to move forward. Please call me Monday morning. I set the phone face up on the counter. Force of old habit. Then I changed my mind, picked it up, and turned it face down. Patricia Howe's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Wheaton, and walking in there on the 27th of December felt like crossing a border. The kind of border you can't uncross. Patricia was in her early 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and the manner of someone who had heard every version of this particular story and found none of them surprising. She didn't offer me sympathy, exactly. She offered me precision, which was far more useful. Tell me about the assets, she said, and I told her. We spent 90 minutes together. By the end, I had a clear picture. Not comfortable, but clear. Illinois law would treat our marriage as an economic partnership. The house, the retirement accounts, my documented career reduction, all of it was relevant. The dissipation claim, money spent on Dana, would require documentation, but Patricia believed we had a basis to pursue it. The key was records. I need you to pull everything you legally have access to, she said. Joint accounts, shared statements, any credit line where your name appears. Do it quietly and do it completely before he has any reason to move things. I went home and spent the next 3 days at my kitchen table with 11 years of financial history spread around me. What I found was methodical, which made it worse. There were charges, not enormous, but consistent, at hotels in Chicago, at a restaurant in the West Loop that I'd always assumed was for client dinners, at a jewelry boutique in the Gold Coast neighborhood that had never appeared in any gift I'd ever received. The pattern became visible the way a picture emerges in a puzzle. One piece doesn't tell you anything, but by the time you've placed enough of them, you can't pretend you don't see the image. I photographed everything. I emailed copies to Patricia and to a separate personal email account Nate didn't know existed, which I'd created years ago for professional invoices and never mentioned. I was grateful now for that small accident of privacy. Meanwhile, something was shifting at home. Nate had spent the days after Christmas in a state of suspended tension, physically present, emotionally absent, watching me in the way a person watches weather. He'd made one attempt at conversation on the 26th, standing in the kitchen doorway while I was making tea, saying, "We should talk, Claire. Really talk." "I agree," I said pleasantly. "I'll let you know when I'm ready." That pleasantness unnerved him more than anger would have. I could see it. He'd expected tears, or recriminations, or the kind of explosive confrontation that follows a revelation like the one Dana had delivered. He hadn't expected me to continue moving through the house calmly, making tea, feeding the dog, watering the indoor plants. I had learned something in those sleepless hours on Christmas night, that composure, deployed strategically, is a form of power. The turning point came on December 30th. I had driven to the DuPage County Recorder's office to pull a copy of our property deed, a routine step Patricia had requested. I was in the parking garage, about to pull out, when my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from a shared family cloud account that Nate and I had set up years ago for photos, never fully used, mostly forgotten. He had apparently forgotten it entirely. There was a photo, auto-synced from his phone, the way photos sometimes are when settings go unchanged for years. It had uploaded that morning. It showed Nate and Dana sitting in a restaurant booth. Christmas decorations visible in the background, his hand on hers across the table. Both of them smiling at the camera, the easy, unguarded smile of two people who believed they were completely alone. The timestamp read December 25th. Christmas Day. The day after her phone call to me. He had spent Christmas Day with her. I sat in that parking garage for a long time. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. I didn't cry. I felt instead a crystallization, the way supercooled water suddenly becomes ice. The structure had always been there, and now it simply became visible. I saved the photo to my separate email. I sent it to Patricia with 3 words. Found the proof. She responded within 20 minutes. This is significant. Proceed as planned. I drove home. Nate's car was in the driveway. I walked in through the front door, hung up my coat, and called out that I was back. He appeared from his office looking, as usual, like a man waiting for a verdict. "Good errands?" he asked. "Very productive," I said. And I went upstairs to change my shoes, because I had more to do. The first week of January moved quickly. Patricia filed the initial petition on the 5th. Under Illinois law, once the petition is filed, both parties are subject to automatic financial restraining orders. Neither spouse can dissipate, transfer, or encumber marital assets without court permission. That provision exists precisely to prevent the kind of quiet asset shifting that Patricia had warned me about. Nate was served at his office on the afternoon of January 7th. I know the exact moment he received the papers because he called me 12 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. His message was controlled, but only barely. He said he thought we needed to talk before things went any further. He said he was coming home. I texted Patricia. "He's been served. He's on his way home." She responded, "You don't have to speak to him without counsel. You can simply say that." When he came through the door that evening, his face had the particular look of a man who has just discovered that the woman he underestimated has been thinking several moves ahead of him. "You filed," he said. "I did," I said, "without even talking to me first." "Nate," I said, "I gave you 11 years of talking." He went upstairs. I heard him on the phone within minutes. Low voice, door half closed. I didn't need to guess who he was calling. What I hadn't fully anticipated was Dana. 3 days later, she called me directly. Not from an unknown number this time. From her own cell. I answered because Patricia had advised me to document all contact. Her tone had changed completely from Christmas Eve. That measured delivery was gone. She was clipped, almost corporate. "I think you should understand," she said, "that Nate is not going to let this go the way you're imagining. He has resources you don't, and I have 7 years of evidence that this marriage was already over before I was ever involved." "Evidence of what, exactly?" I asked. A pause. "Emails, conversations, things you said, things you didn't do." "If you have documentation relevant to our divorce proceedings," I said, "please direct it to my attorney." Another pause. Longer this time. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Dana," I said, "you called my home on Christmas Eve to tell me my husband had been lying to me for 7 years. I want you to think very carefully about who, in this situation, has made the mistake." I ended the call and documented it immediately. Time, duration, substance. Sent the notes to Patricia. What followed was a 2-week escalation that I had not fully prepared for emotionally, though I had prepared for it legally. Nate's attorney, a sharp, expensive man named Greg Purcell, who worked out of a firm in Chicago, sent a letter questioning my claim of career sacrifice, suggesting that my part-time schedule had been my own choice and preference and had nothing to do with supporting Nate's career. He also attached, pointedly, a copy of a performance review from my own landscape consulting firm from 4 years ago, in which I had described myself as not seeking expanded hours. It was a real document. Out of context, it stung. Patricia responded within 48 hours with a counterfiling that included 3 years of financial records, the Christmas Day photograph, and a reconstructed timeline of hotel and restaurant charges that correlated date by date with specific business trips Nate had claimed were client-related. The dissipation claim was formally entered. Nate called me that night, not through his attorney this time. His voice was different. Tight. "This is going to get ugly, Claire. I don't want that. Neither do you. Tell me what you want, Nate. I want to settle this quietly. No more filings. No public record. We split the house value down the middle. You keep your retirement account and we're done." "And the 7 years?" I said. Silence. "You can't put a number on that," he said. "Patricia can," I said. "And she has." He hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed in the room we'd shared for 8 years, and I let myself feel. Not the pain, which was still there, somewhere beneath the adrenaline, but the exhaustion. Real, bone-level exhaustion. I had been running on precision and purpose for 2 weeks, and I needed to stop briefly before I could continue. I called my sister in Portland and asked if I could come for the weekend. She asked no questions. She said, "Come now." I booked a flight for Friday morning. I packed Biscuit into the car and dropped him with a neighbor who adored him. I texted Patricia, taking the weekend. No decisions. Back Monday. She wrote back, "Good. Rest. This is a marathon." I drove to O'Hare in the January dark, and for the first time in weeks, I turned off the part of my brain that was cataloging, planning, preparing. I put on the most ordinary playlist I owned. I let the highway unspool in front of me. 2 days. I gave myself exactly 2 days. My sister Rachel lives in a narrow craftsman house in the Selwood neighborhood of Portland, 2 blocks from the river. She teaches high school English and is the kind of person who keeps a full refrigerator and asks precise questions. When I arrived, she made me sit at her kitchen table, poured 2 glasses of wine, and said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning." So I did. I talked for almost 2 hours. Rachel listened without interrupting, which is a skill I've always admired in her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You already know what you're doing. You just needed to hear yourself say it out loud." She was right. There's a difference between knowing a thing alone in the dark at 3 in the morning and knowing it in a warm kitchen while someone who loves you listens without flinching. The plan didn't change, but I changed slightly. I became more solid in it. I slept 9 hours both nights. I walked along the river. I ate Rachel's cooking and watched terrible television and let myself, for 48 hours, not be a woman in the middle of a legal battle. Just a person. Just her sister. I flew back to Chicago on Sunday night, feeling like myself, the version of myself I needed to be. Monday brought the first attempted seduction. I use that word deliberately because that's what it was. Not romantic, but transactional. The kind of appeal that disguises itself as generosity while actually attempting to purchase your silence. Nate's attorney, Greg Purcell, sent a revised settlement offer. It was, on paper, more generous than the first. 53% of the house equity to me rather than 50. An additional lump sum, described vaguely as acknowledgement of marital contribution. A clean, quiet resolution, the document emphasized. No further litigation, no public record. I read it twice. I forwarded it to Patricia. "It's better than the first offer," she said on the phone that afternoon, "but it's still below what a judge is likely to award given the dissipation documentation. They're scared of the Christmas photo and the financial trail. They want this gone." "I know," I said. "What do you recommend?" "I recommend we decline and proceed to the discovery phase." "Then that's what we do," I said. Patricia sent the declination by end of day. I felt the weight of the decision. Not doubt, but the awareness of consequence. Every door I declined to take closed behind me. But closed doors, I was learning, could be a form of clarity. Dana made her own move the following Thursday. She emailed me directly. A long message, carefully written, the kind of thing that had clearly been drafted and revised. She explained in detail that I hadn't asked for the history of her relationship with Nate, how it had begun, how it had evolved, how she had wanted, many times, to tell me. She described herself as a woman trapped in an impossible position. She said she bore me no ill will. She said she hoped, eventually, I might understand. It was a compelling email, genuinely well written, and I recognized it, underneath the sincerity, for what it was. An attempt to position herself as a sympathetic actor before any formal deposition in which she might be compelled to speak. I forwarded it to Patricia without response. "Good," Patricia said. "Don't engage." I didn't. What I did instead, that week, was something I hadn't expected to need. I told people, not many. I'm a private person by nature, and the instinct to contain a humiliation, to keep it small, to control who knows, is powerful. But Rachel had said something before I left Portland that stayed with me. She said, "Isolation is how they win, Claire, not legally, emotionally." So I told my close friend Judith, who'd known Nate and me since our first year in Naperville. I told her over coffee at her kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, as plainly as I could. She listened. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. She didn't offer advice. She said, "Whatever you need." I told my colleague, Marcus, who had worked alongside me at the landscape firm and who I trusted professionally. He was practical and discreet and knew, without being told, not to make it a workplace matter. And I called my mother, which was the conversation I'd been dreading most. My mother has been widowed for 12 years and has strong opinions about the sanctity of marriage. But she surprised me. When I finished telling her, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in her careful way, A man who would do that for 7 years is not a man worth keeping. I held the phone and felt something release in my chest. I was not alone. That sounds simple. It wasn't. After weeks of moving through this largely in silence, of managing my own reactions for strategic purposes, of keeping my face neutral across dinner tables and phone calls, the simple fact of being witnessed by people who loved me was, unexpectedly, the thing that steadied me most. Nate and Dana, I would later understand, had been counting on my isolation. They had structured the situation, consciously or not, so that shame and privacy would do part of their work for them. They had miscalculated. It was a Tuesday evening in late January when Nate came home, not to negotiate through attorneys, home. He used his key, which he technically still had every legal right to use since the house remained jointly titled pending resolution. He knocked first, which I thought was a strange courtesy given that the house was half his. I heard the knock, heard the key, heard his voice calling my name from the front hall. I came downstairs. He was standing just inside the door, coat still on, and he had brought Dana. That surprised me, not because her presence was irrational. I understand now that it was a calculated move, but because the sheer audacity of it required a moment of adjustment. She stood slightly behind him, dressed in the kind of careful neutrality that signals effort. No jewelry, subdued colors, hair pulled back. She looked deliberately non-threatening. And yet the moment I saw her standing in my hallway, the hallway where Biscuit's leash hung, where my grandmother's mirror had lived for 8 years, something in my chest went very still and very hard. "We just want to talk," Nate said. "No lawyers, just us." I looked at Dana, then at Nate. "Come in," I said. "I'll make coffee." I made coffee because I needed 3 minutes in the kitchen to text Patricia. N and D here, at house, talking. I'll document. Her response came as I was filling the carafe. "You can ask them to leave. You don't have to do this." I considered that for exactly 5 seconds. Then I put my phone in my pocket and carried the coffee to the living room. I wanted to hear what they had come to say. I wanted it on record, in my own memory, that I had given them the opportunity to show me who they were, and that they had taken it. They sat on the couch. I sat across from them in the armchair that had been mine since we moved in, the one Nate had always said was too big for the room. Dana spoke first, which surprised me again. She said she wanted to apologize for calling on Christmas Eve, for the way it had been delivered, for the shock of it. She said she had acted impulsively and that she regretted causing me pain. She said it looking directly at me, and she was good at it. Her voice steady, her expression open, her hands folded in her lap like a woman in a job interview who had prepared for every question. Then she pivoted. She said that she understood I was hurt, but that prolonging a legal battle would damage everyone involved. She mentioned, gently, Nate's reputation and the professional consequences of a contentious public filing. She mentioned that discovery proceedings had a way of surfacing information that was painful for everyone. She looked at me when she said this in a way that was meant to communicate that the pain would be distributed, mine included. "What information?" I said. "There were times," Dana said carefully, "when you and Nate were already very distant, when you had spoken to him about being unhappy, things that might suggest the marriage had broken down independently of our relationship." I kept my face still. "Dana," I said, "are you suggesting that if I don't settle quietly, you'll testify in a deposition that our marriage was already failing?" "I'm not threatening anything," she said. "I'm just being honest with you." "That would be perjury," I said pleasantly, "unless you have documentation. And if you have documentation of private conversations between a husband and wife, I'd be very interested in how you obtained it." The room changed temperature. Nate leaned forward. His voice was different now, quieter, more deliberate. With that particular control men use, when they want you to understand, they're choosing not to raise it. Claire, stop. We are trying to give you a way out of this that doesn't destroy the next 2 years of your life. We're offering you something fair. Patricia Howe is going to charge you $50,000 to take this through a full trial, and at the end of it, you'll have the same outcome you could have right now. Or more, I said. Don't count on more, he said. We sat with that for a moment. The furnace clicked on somewhere below us. Biscuit, who had been asleep in the kitchen, trotted in and looked at the three of us with the mild, untroubled curiosity of a dog who does not understand human deception. I was briefly grateful for him. I appreciate you coming in person, I said finally. I do. But I'm going to continue working with Patricia. If you want to make a revised offer, it should go through her. Dana's composure slipped, just briefly, not dramatically. She was too careful for that. But her jaw tightened in the way that happens when a person has been performing patients for an extended period, and the performance is beginning to cost something. You're making this harder than it needs to be, she said. You called my house on Christmas Eve, I said. You've been involved with my husband for 7 years. You came here tonight, to my home, together, to tell me that my own marriage was a fiction I should quietly agree to discard. And you're asking me to explain how I'm the one making this hard. Nobody answered. They left 10 minutes later. Nate paused in the doorway and looked back at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it. A frustration edged with something very close to reluctant recognition. He had spent 11 years living alongside me. Some part of him, I think, had always known I was more capable than the life we'd built together required me to be. Dana didn't look back at all. I locked the door. I stood in the hallway with my hand still on the deadbolt, and Biscuit pressed his warm flank against my leg, and I let the fear arrive. Real. Physical. The kind that lives in your stomach and makes your hands feel slightly cold. They knew things. They had resources. Nate wasn't bluffing about Patricia's fees, and Dana's composure during that conversation had reminded me, with uncomfortable clarity, that she had maintained this deception across 7 years and several hundred ordinary days. She was not a careless person. She was a very careful one. But fear, I had learned by then, is not a verdict. It is weather. You can stand in it without being destroyed by it. I went to the kitchen. I pulled out my legal pad. I wrote down every word I could recall from that conversation, in order, while it was still fresh in my body. Then I called Patricia's voicemail and recited it all back slowly, steadily, until I reached the end. I'll call you in the morning, I said. We have work to do. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in mid-February at Patricia's office in Wheaton. I want to describe what that morning felt like, because people imagine legal proceedings as cold and procedural, and in some ways they are. But there is also something uniquely intimate about sitting in a conference room with someone who has deceived you for 7 years and watching them explain themselves under oath. Intimate is not quite the right word. Exposed, perhaps. The way a room looks after the furniture has been removed. Nothing to soften the corners, nothing to redirect the eye. I arrived 15 minutes early. Patricia was already there, her files arranged with the particular order of someone who knows exactly where every piece of the argument lives. She looked at me once, assessed something, and said, "How are you?" "Ready," I said. And I was. Not calm in the way of someone who isn't frightened, but calm in the way of someone who has decided that being frightened is not relevant information. Nate arrived with Greg Purcell. Purcell was as sharp in person as he'd seemed in writing. Expensive suit, careful posture, the manner of a man who was accustomed to controlling rooms. Nate had dressed conservatively, the way I'd watched him dress for important client meetings 100 times. Navy jacket, no tie. The approachable professional calculation of someone who had thought carefully about how he wanted to appear. He looked, walking through that door, exactly like what he'd always appeared to be. Which was, of course, the problem. Patricia opened the deposition with straightforward questions. Dates, figures, the general architecture of our marriage, where we lived, how long, what I had contributed professionally. Nate answered them smoothly. His voice was measured, his eye contact appropriate, his answers just detailed enough to seem forthcoming and just vague enough to foreclose follow-up. He'd been well coached. Then Patricia put the Christmas Day photograph on the table. Mr. Alderman, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 7. Can you identify the individuals in this photograph and the date it was taken? Nate looked at the photo. A muscle in his jaw moved, the only visible sign that anything in him had shifted. That's myself and Dana Kowalski. And the date? I believe December 25th. Of last year. Yes. And where were you on December 25th of last year? A pause. Purcell said, I'd like a moment with my client. Patricia said, Of course. They stepped into the hallway. I sat very still. The court reporter's hands rested on her keyboard. The room was quiet enough that I could hear traffic from the street 14 floors below. I thought about the Christmas Day photo syncing from his phone to a cloud account he'd forgotten existed. 7 years of careful concealment, undone by a setting he'd never thought to check. When they returned, Nate gave a prepared answer about visiting a family acquaintance. Vague, unlocalizable, plausibly deniable. Patricia noted it and moved on without pressing. She was not interested in winning that particular exchange. She was interested in the pattern. She moved to the financial records. She walked him through the hotel charges, the restaurant receipts, the jewelry boutique, item by item, date by date, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has all day and knows it. For each one, she asked the same simple question. Can you tell me what this charge was for? Nate had answers for most of them. Client entertainment, a birthday gift, a business event. Each answer was individually plausible. Strung together, they formed something that only held if you agreed not to look at the whole. Patricia then placed a grid on the table, a document her paralegal had assembled over 3 weeks, showing that every single one of these charges correlated within 48 hours with a documented trip or work event during which Nate had been with Dana. 18 transactions, 18 correlating dates. A pattern that was no longer a pattern once you saw it. It was a record. Mr. Alderman, would you characterize it as a coincidence that all 18 of these transactions occurred within 48 hours of a documented travel event shared with Ms. Kowalski? Purcell objected to the framing. Patricia rephrased with the patience of someone who had done this many times. Nate answered. His answer didn't hold together. Not because he was unintelligent, but because there is no coherent answer to a question whose premise is correct. He contradicted himself once, mildly, and then corrected the contradiction, which made things worse. I watched his composure thin the way ice thins in early spring, still present, still holding a shape, but no longer reliable. Dana's deposition followed in the afternoon. She was composed and prepared, and she moved through Patricia's early questions without visible difficulty. But there was a problem she hadn't anticipated, which was the January visit to the house. She had come, that evening, under the impression that the conversation was private, that my account of it would be my word against hers. What she didn't know was that I had called Patricia's voicemail immediately afterward and recited the conversation in full with a timestamp before a single detail could fade. Ms. Kowalski, on the evening of January 21st, did you visit the marital residence? I did. Were you present at that visit voluntarily? Yes. At that visit, did you make any statements to Mrs. Alderman regarding potential testimony in this proceeding? Her attorney murmured something. Dana said, I expressed some thoughts about the nature of the Alderman's marriage. Did you suggest that testimony about Mrs. Alderman's conduct in the marriage might be presented in these proceedings if Mrs. Alderman did not settle? I didn't frame it as a threat. How did you frame it? As a realistic assessment of how these proceedings tend to unfold. Patricia let that sit for a moment, long enough to be uncomfortable, and then placed a single page on the table. I'm showing you Exhibit 14. This is a transcription of a voicemail from you, left on Mrs. Alderman's personal cell phone on November 9th of last year, 6 weeks before Christmas Eve. It was a voicemail nobody in that room had mentioned until that moment. Dana had called me once in November, a brief message, professionally framed. Something about coordinating details for a firm event she knew I was involved in planning. Ordinary on its surface. Except at the end, almost as an afterthought, her voice had shifted to something warmer, more personal. I just want you to know, for what it's worth, that Nate talks about you all the time. He really does care. Said to a woman whose husband she had been with for 7 years. Ms. Kowalski, Patricia said very quietly, why would you call Mrs. Alderman to reassure her that her husband cared about her while you were in a 7-year relationship with him? The room went absolutely still. Dana opened her mouth, closed it. Her attorney leaned in, and they exchanged a murmur. Dana opened her mouth again and began a sentence that didn't finish itself in any direction that made sense. She tried a second approach. That one dissolved too. I watched her, this careful, deliberate woman who had maintained an entire parallel world for 7 years, discover that there is no coherent answer to a question that has caught you exactly as you are. I sat with my hands folded on the table, and I looked at the middle distance, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in that room. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter than either. The specific peace of a person who prepared thoroughly, moved patiently, and has just watched the truth do exactly what the truth does when you give it enough room. The ruling came on a Friday in late March. Patricia called me at 9:15 in the morning while I was in the backyard turning over the first frozen layer of the vegetable garden, an act I'd started doing early that year, needing, I think, the physical fact of preparing ground for something new. We won, she said, fully. I put down my garden fork. Let me tell you what that meant in practical terms, because the practical terms are important. This was not a cinematic moment of a gavel falling and a villain being led away in handcuffs. It was quieter than that, and in its quietness, more complete. The judge awarded me 61% of the equity in the Naperville house. At current market value, that amounted to a difference of approximately $64,000 over an even split. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a number attached to a decision. A judge's written decision, part of the public record, that said, the sacrifice was real, the harm was documented, and the law recognizes it. The dissipation finding was upheld. The 18 transactions Patricia had cataloged, hotels, dinners, the jewelry boutique, were formally classified as marital asset dissipation. Nate was required to reimburse the marital estate for those expenditures. The sum was not enormous, but its determination was. My career reduction was recognized explicitly in the judgment. Patricia had submitted 3 years of tax records, my original hire letter showing my full-time offer, and 2 statements from colleagues who had worked alongside me in the years before and after I scaled back. The judge's language was specific. The petitioner demonstrably reduced her professional activity in service of the marital household. 11 words that I read 4 times. The retirement accounts were divided favorably, accounting for the years of lower contributions on my side. Nate received his percentage of the house and his accounts. He was not a destitute man. I want to be accurate about that. He had built real things over 11 years, and the law divided them, not destroyed them. But the settlement he'd pushed for, the quiet, equitable split that erased the 7 years and the dissipation and the documented harm, was not what he received. He received a judgment, a matter of record, something that, if you knew where to look, you could find. He and his attorney had pushed hard in the final weeks for confidentiality clauses. Patricia pushed back harder. There was no gag order. The proceedings were what they were. I heard, through Judith, that Greg Purcell had billed Nate substantially more than my fees to Patricia, a fact that landed with a particular kind of irony given Nate's warning in the living room that night about the cost of fighting. On the afternoon the ruling came through, Patricia met me in person at her office. We shook hands across the conference table where, 2 months earlier, I had watched Nate's composure begin to slip. She handed me a printed copy of the judgment. "You did well," she said. "You were patient, and you were precise. That matters." I thanked her. I meant it completely. I drove home, to the house that was, legally and finally, transitioning to mine alone, and I walked through each room slowly. The kitchen where I'd stood on Christmas Eve with a phone in my hand. The living room where Nate and Dana had sat on the couch in January, under the impression that they could still redirect the story. The bedroom where I'd lain on Christmas night, afraid, and chosen anyway. I stood at the back window and looked at the garden. There was one more thing. Dana had not emerged from the deposition without consequences of her own. Nate's firm had a conflict of interest provision in its employee handbook, a provision that, a colleague of mine had once mentioned offhandedly over dinner, had been quietly revised several years ago in response to some unnamed incident. Under that provision, a romantic relationship between a senior partner and a direct report was a terminable offense. Whether Nate chose to disclose the relationship or the firm discovered it through the public filing, I don't know exactly. What I know is that by the second week of March, Dana Kowalski was no longer employed at Alderman Purcell and Associates. I confirmed this through the firm's public staff directory, which listed current personnel. She had traded 9 years of professional standing, and whatever future she'd imagined, for a relationship that had now become a legal record and a job loss. I thought about that. I tried to feel something about it. Vindication, perhaps, or satisfaction. What I felt instead was something closer to exhaustion and a kind of bleak pity. Not for what she'd lost, for all of the choices she'd made over 7 years that had made her loss inevitable. I called my mother that evening. "It's done," I said. "Come for Easter," she said. "I'll be there," I said. I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, my kitchen, sole and certain, and then I opened the back door and stepped into the early spring air and stood in my garden until the cold drove me back inside. 1.5 years is not a long time, but it is enough to learn the shape of a new life. I sold the Naperville house that August. The market was cooperative, the price was good, and there was nothing about staying that appealed to me. Not the neighborhood, not the commute, not the particular way the morning light came through the east kitchen window in a way I'd once found beautiful and now found merely familiar. I sold it to a young couple with a German shepherd who walked through the house looking at each other the way people look at each other when they've found the right thing. I bought a smaller place, a 1940s brick bungalow in Oak Park, on a quiet street with elm trees and a postage stamp backyard that I immediately began converting into a proper garden. It was mine, outright, with a modest mortgage I could carry on my own income. The first morning I woke up in it, I lay in the unfamiliar bedroom and listened to the unfamiliar street sounds and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the space I was inhabiting corresponded to who I actually was. I went back to work full-time. My employer offered me a senior consultant position that had opened up in the spring. I took it. It involved more client-facing work, more independent project management, a salary that surprised me a little with its adequacy. I had forgotten what I was capable of when my attention wasn't divided. By winter, I had led 3 full residential redesign projects independently. One of them, a difficult sloped backyard on the North Shore, was selected for a regional design journal feature. Patricia sent me a note when it was published. It read, "Told you so." Judith and I started meeting for dinner every few weeks, not to talk about Nate, increasingly, but about other things. Her children, her work, a novel she was reading. The particular joy of a Thursday evening, free with no obligation to account for it to anyone. My mother came to visit in October and stayed a week. On her last morning, she said, unprompted, "You look like yourself." I didn't know how to answer that, so I just poured her more coffee. I heard about Nate and Dana in pieces, the way one hears about anyone in the particular social geography of suburban Illinois. Nate had left the firm by summer, not dramatically, but by attrition. The public record had consequences in commercial real estate, where reputation is the product. He moved to a smaller firm in the western suburbs. Adequate, but diminished. His own doing. Dana had not found equivalent employment in the industry. She was working, I heard, in a different sector entirely. I didn't invest much energy in finding out more. What I found instead, in their absence from my attention, was something I can only describe as room. The enormous cognitive and emotional energy I had spent for years in a low-grade state of unacknowledged grief. That energy was available to me again. For work, for Biscuit's walks, for the garden, for Rachel's monthly calls, for the gradual construction of a life that actually fit. I was 39 years old, living alone in a brick bungalow in Oak Park with a golden retriever, a senior consulting position, and a garden that was going to be extraordinary by spring. I had built it myself. That was not a consolation. It was the point. I've thought about what I would tell the woman I was on Christmas Eve, standing in that kitchen doorway, phone in hand, candles burning. I would say, "You already know. You've known longer than you think." Fear is not the opposite of courage. It's the beginning of it. I won because I prepared quietly, moved carefully, and refused, at every point, to trade my dignity for someone else's comfort. The truth doesn't need your help. It only needs your patience. What would you have done in my place? Leave a comment. Share this story. And thank you, genuinely, for listening.